At 2:17 in the morning, when the desert wind flattened itself against the earth, and even the smugglers on the border roads killed their headlights, something moved in the dark that almost nobody in the region knew existed. No public warning, no presidential address, no carrier group splashed across satellite television. Just a silent shift in the balance of power, already underway before the people who funded the violence had time to understand they had been found. For years, Iran's shadow network had operated through layers of deniability: front companies, proxy militias, religious cover, humanitarian cargo, encrypted couriers, buried warehouses, and men whose names never appeared on uniforms. Rockets appeared where there had been none. Drones rose from empty strips of dirt. Explosives crossed borders hidden inside commerce. Every attack was designed to feel ownerless, untraceable, inevitable. And then, in a single night, the United States reached into that machinery with surgical precision and hit the one thing the network could not afford to lose: confidence. The threat had not announced itself with one spectacular strike. That was the genius of it. It grew the way poison spreads, quietly, in veins too small to notice at first. Militia commanders in Iraq received new guidance and better weapons. Cells in Syria adjusted their supply routes. Maritime teams in the Gulf trained against commercial traffic patterns. A web of loyal intermediaries, many of them outside the public eye, began coordinating across a corridor that stretched from Tehran's strategic imagination to the fractured front lines of the Levant. The objective was larger than terror in the conventional sense. This was coercion through ambiguity. Make every embassy vulnerable. Make every base calculate the cost of staying. Make every ally wonder if Washington still had the patience to hold ground in a region where enemies never fought openly unless the odds were theirs. The network did not need to win battles. It only needed to keep pressure constant, blood slow but steady, fear normalized. American intelligence saw the pattern long before headlines did. A drone launch here, a financial transfer there, a convoy that disappeared from one side of a frontier and reappeared as assembled munitions somewhere else. Signals analysts began noticing repetition inside the irregularity. Certain handoffs always happened after certain sermons. Certain warehouses always went dark 2 days before attacks. Certain couriers never used the same route twice, but always crossed through the same dead terrain at the same hour. It was enough to sketch an outline, not enough to strike. Because if Washington moved too early, it would hit a symptom, and symptoms could be replaced. What mattered was the spine. Then came the reversal. It did not begin with explosions. It began with silence from people who never missed their check-ins. A trusted intermediary in the network failed to appear at a safe compound outside Al-Qaim. A shipment of precision guidance components vanished from a convoy manifest without ever surfacing in black market channels. A mid-level coordinator using 3 secure devices went completely dark, not because he had escaped, but because he had been watched so thoroughly that the Americans already knew every place he intended to hide. Somewhere inside the system, the shadow operators started to feel it. Their routines were no longer invisible. Their internal confidence, built over years of surviving sanctions, assassinations, airstrikes, and political upheaval, began to crack. They had grown used to retaliation. They were not prepared for penetration. That was when the mission changed from monitoring to execution. The unit assigned to the operation was never meant for spectacle. It was assembled for the kind of violence that has to occur faster than recognition. A joint task force, layered and deniable in its own way, drew from America's most experienced edge: special mission operators, signals exploitation teams, Air Force stealth crews, naval surveillance assets offshore, cyber specialists already inside parts of the enemy's communications environment, and intelligence officers who had spent months turning fragments into a killable picture. This was not a blunt force raid built for television mythology. It was a machine of interlocking precision. Every element had a timing window. Every aircraft had a contingency. Every trigger authority had a legal chain, a diplomatic shadow, and a clock running against dawn. At the center of the target package was a site most maps ignored: an industrial complex disguised as a logistics transfer facility on a barren stretch of terrain tied to militia corridors feeding both Iraq and Syria. From above, it looked forgettable. A few hangars, fuel bladders, generators, service roads, concrete walls baked to the same dull color as the surrounding earth. But underneath that shell, American analysts believed the complex was functioning as a fusion point for the network's regional terror architecture. Guidance kits, drone airframes, encrypted communications equipment, forged manifests, cache, safe room quarters for liaison officers moving between proxies and their state patrons. And perhaps most critically, one senior operational planner whose survival depended on never being photographed in the wrong place. If the assessment was right, this facility was not merely a warehouse. It was a brainstem. Weeks of preparation turned the target from a suspicion into a three-dimensional living model. Satellites watched the heat signature of generator cycles. Drones loitered high enough to stay outside routine detection. Cyber teams mapped digital habits. When doors unlocked, when internal cameras looped, when backup power kicked in, when guards checked phones, when encrypted bursts left the compound toward relay sites farther east. Human sources filled the emotional gaps no satellite could see. Which commander drank too much tea before midnight prayers? Which sentry grew inattentive in cold hours before dawn? Which loading bay was reserved for cargo important enough to be hidden even from allies? The Americans were not just planning to hit a building. They were planning to enter the enemy's rhythm and break it in one motion. The final decision did not come in anger. It came in calculation. The network was approaching a threshold. Intelligence suggested new attack packages were being staged for U.S. personnel and partner infrastructure in the region. Wait longer, and the cost would rise. Strike crudely, and Iran's proxy ecosystem would absorb the blow, mourn loudly, and rebuild quietly. To matter, the action had to do more than kill men and shatter concrete. It had to expose vulnerability at the highest level of their covert confidence. The order was given. The approach began far from the target, beyond public attention, over black water and empty airspace where only instruments and discipline mattered. Stealth aircraft moved first, not to announce force, but to erase warning. Their role was less cinematic than essential. Blind sensors, isolate the battle space, and stand ready to vaporize hard points if the raid turned chaotic. Offshore, naval platforms tightened the surveillance ring. In distant operations centers, analysts leaned over glowing screens, watching symbols crawl across digital maps as if war had become geometry. On board the insertion aircraft, nobody spoke more than necessary. Weapons had been checked twice. Oxygen smelled metallic. The men sitting shoulder to shoulder in the dark knew the brief by heart, but memory was not comfort. They were flying toward a place where one open door, one unplanned vehicle, one guard looking the wrong way could turn a precise raid into a regional incident. Below them, the terrain unfolded like a dead ocean. Wadis cut through the desert like old scars. Abandoned structures cast angular shadows in moonlight. Here and there, isolated headlights moved along smuggling tracks, then disappeared. The target compound sat in its own pool of faint industrial glow, confident in isolation, protected by routine and deception more than heavy fortification. That confidence was the real shield. It had convinced the men inside that they were too obscure for a direct American reach, too politically inconvenient to become the center of a major operation, too buried inside proxy layers to warrant elite force attention. They were wrong on every count. Minutes out, the first phase triggered. Not explosions, absence. Cameras along one perimeter looped on their own feeds. A relay stuttered. A local communications node drowned in noise so subtle it felt like malfunction. The compound did not go blind all at once. That would have screamed attack. Instead, its senses became unreliable in pieces, the way a mind deteriorates under shock. Then the assault element slipped in through the seam between expectation and recognition. The helicopters came low and mean, masked by terrain until the final approach, rotors hammering the night only at the last moment when concealment no longer mattered. To the guards on the outer edge, the sound arrived too late to interpret. Some looked up, some froze. One reached for a radio that no longer had a useful world on the other end. The landing was violent and exact. Operators hit the ground already oriented, sectors assigned, infrared strobes invisible to everyone but their own. Breaching teams peeled toward entry points mapped from months of surveillance. Overhead, unseen, the sky belonged entirely to the United States. The first shots were suppressed and intimate. A gate sentry dropped before his warning left his throat. A rooftop observer pivoted into a laser-marked sight picture and disappeared backward. Then the tempo accelerated. Charges punched doors inward. White light flooded corridors. Commands snapped in clipped English and sharper hand signals. Every room was a question answered in seconds. Clear, occupied, hold, move, breach, clear again. The men inside the compound were not amateurs, but they were arranged for security theater, not a raid by professionals who had rehearsed the structure down to stairwells and generator housings. By the time the defenders understood the scale of what had entered their perimeter, the Americans were already at the inner buildings. Inside the main operations block, the air changed. The rooms were colder, cleaner, more deliberate. Hard drives stacked in anti-static cases. Wall maps annotated not for local security, but for cross-border movement. Components laid out on tables in careful progression, airframes, control units, optical assemblies, shaped charges engineered for transport and rapid assembly. This was not a militia garage. It was an industrialized pipeline for covert war. Operators moved through it with practiced greed, photographing, tagging, seizing, triaging. Sensitive site exploitation teams cracked safes, imaged servers, bagged notebooks, ripped storage modules from workstations, and swept biometric traces that could tie identities across the network. The raid was no longer only about destruction. It was about inheritance. Whatever intelligence survived the night would be turned against every node connected to it. Then came the discovery that changed the operation from major to historic. Beneath a false floor concealed under freight pallets and machine parts, the team found a hardened access point leading into a sublevel the overhead imagery had never fully resolved. The space below was not large, but it was decisive. Climate-controlled, shielded, built for continuity. On one wall were communications racks tied to routing equipment far more sophisticated than anything proxies should have possessed on their own. On another were locked cases containing guidance packages and miniature navigation assemblies consistent with systems used to convert unguided weapons into precision tools. And in the inner room, guarded not by bulk but by secrecy, was the man American analysts had hoped, but never guaranteed, would be present. The liaison planner linking state strategy to proxy execution. The one whose fingerprints were on maritime harassment, rocket attacks, drone dispersal, and cross-border terror facilitation across multiple theaters. He did not die in a blaze of resistance. That is how myths die, not dramatically, but abruptly. Found in his safe chamber, cut off from the network he helped build, stunned by the speed with which the walls around him had become meaningless. His capture, or confirmed elimination, depending on the contingency branch triggered in that final room, mattered less than what it proved. He had believed distance, compartmentalization, and deniability made him untouchable. Instead, on a nameless night in a place designed to be forgettable, the most powerful military in the world had arrived at his door with his schedule already memorized. Outside, the compound was beginning to fracture under the weight of the next phase. With the exploitation window closing, targeteers cleared the strike matrix. Weapons from overhead platforms began dismantling the site's future. Fuel storage erupted first, sending a tower of orange into the black sky. Secondary blasts followed from ammunition and drone components cooked off in chain reactions. A hardened workshop collapsed inward under precision fire, its roof folding like paper. One communications mast snapped in sparks. Another vanished in dust and shrapnel. The sublevel entrance was rendered permanently useless. Not scorched, not damaged, erased. The objective was deliberate annihilation of function. When sunrise came, there would be no quick repair, no salvage crews quietly patching holes, no spokesman honestly claiming operations were unaffected. And still the Americans did not linger. That was the discipline of the thing. Great raids are not remembered because they stay. They are remembered because they leave before chaos can surround them. The assault force collapsed inward, accountability checks snapping through the net. Sensitive materials were loaded. Casualties, if any, were managed in motion. Rear security peeled back from outer walls. One last sweep confirmed no man had been left in a blind corner or buried under the violence of entry. Then the extraction began with the same brutal precision as the insertion. Helicopters lifted through smoke and dust while fires below painted the compound in a hellish pulse of orange and white. Any pursuing vehicles forming on outer roads were broken apart from above before they could mass into a coherent response. The task force vanished into the night, carrying more than bodies and captured hardware. It carried proof. By dawn, the region was caught between rumor and reality. Militia channels erupted first, confused, contradictory, panicked. Some claimed a drone strike. Others insisted it had been an internal betrayal. Some denied anything significant had been lost, even as emergency networks lit up with requests for missing personnel, alternate routes, emergency funds, replacement communications, and confirmation that secondary safe sites had not also been exposed. In Tehran's shadow bureaucracy, men who had spent careers trusting layered secrecy now had to confront a devastating possibility. The Americans had not just struck a node. They had mapped the architecture well enough to choose the exact node whose destruction would spread fear through all the others. The geopolitical message was sharper than any press release could have been. Washington had demonstrated that escalation did not require spectacle, and deterrence did not require occupation. The United States could still find the hidden gears inside Iran's regional proxy machine and tear out the ones that mattered most, quietly, quickly, and at a time of its own choosing. For allies in the Gulf and for commanders sitting on exposed bases farther west, the raid restored something that had been eroding: the perception of reach. For Iran's partners and clients, it injected corrosive doubt. Every handler might be watched. Every warehouse might be mapped. Every courier route might already exist on an American screen. Terror networks survive on confidence in the shadows. That confidence had been hit harder than the buildings. And there was another consequence, less visible but more enduring. Intelligence harvested in those brief, violent minutes would not stay in evidence bags. It would metastasize into follow-on operations, sanctions packets sharpened by names and numbers, intercept programs retargeted by recovered devices, allied raids guided by captured route structures, financial nodes exposed through ledgers seized in the sublevel, future plots strangled in paperwork before they ever became explosions. This is the part the public rarely sees. One night of force can become 6 months of quiet suffocation. A door kicked open in the desert can echo through ports, ministries, shell companies, and militia safe houses across half a region. None of that means the story ends cleanly. It never does in this theater. Iran's networks are built for pain tolerance. Proxies will rebuild. New couriers will take old routes. New commanders will step into the silhouettes of dead ones. There will be denials, vows of revenge, carefully calibrated retaliation, and the usual performance of outrage for domestic audiences. But something important was taken from them that night, and it cannot be unloaded from a truck or wired from a bank or trained in a camp. The aura was broken. The belief that distance and ambiguity guaranteed survival. That was what burned. So when people ask what the United States actually did, the answer is larger than one raid, one explosion, or one captured planner. It reached into a system built on invisibility and made it visible to itself. It showed that the map of terror was no longer owned by the men hiding inside it. In war's oldest language, that is domination, not constant occupation, not endless bombing, but the ability to appear where the enemy feels safest and leave before he can even explain what happened. And somewhere now, in compounds that still stand, in offices with blackout curtains, and in desert facilities pretending to be warehouses, men are listening differently to the night. Generators hum. Guards pace. Radios whisper. Vehicles arrive and depart beneath coded paperwork. On the surface, the machine still moves. But underneath, the certainty is gone. Because once a hidden empire has been entered from the inside, once its planners have been dragged into the light, its blueprints seized, its sanctuaries reduced to ash, it can never fully return to sleep. That is the real aftermath of a covert American strike. Not just flames on the horizon, but a permanent haunting. A pause before every phone call. A second look at every convoy. A question in every secure room no one wants to say aloud. How much do they already know? And if the answer is what that night suggested, then the most terrifying thing for Iran's terror architects is not the fire that fell from the sky. It is the possibility that the next operation is already moving.